A horrifying video comes out of police and medical staff crushing Irvo Otieno, a 28-year-old patient at a Virginia hospital, sparking investigations into the incident. 400,000 LAUSD students miss school as the teachers union launches a 3-day strike demanding better wages. And given that this week marks 20 years since the United States invasion of Iraq, I interview Omar Mohammed, an amazingly courageous Iraqi citizen who created an underground resistance movement to ISIS. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Oh, 32323, meaning it is Thursday, March 23rd, 2023. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel, and you can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. Our first news story today is an especially sobering one. A horrifying video has come out this week of police and medical workers crushing a 28-year-old patient at a Virginia hospital, Irvo Otieno. This is surveillance video from a March 6th incident. It shows 7 sheriff's deputies and 3 medical staff members piling on top of Mr. Otieno, pinning him to the floor of the hospital for about 11 minutes until he suffocated to death. There is some background information that has come out with this story, although, of course, we don't know everything, and more information and details will come out in subsequent weeks that we will certainly keep you updated on. But what we do know, at least now, is that Mr. Otieno suffered for a long time from mental health issues. The footage here at this psychiatric hospital shows him sitting, and then when he made a movement, presumably to run out of the hospital, stand up, or resist the medical workers and police officers, that is when they pinned him to the floor. Now, the fact that he was in this Virginia hospital in the first place stems from an incident that happened 3 days prior. Apparently, he walked onto his neighbor's lawn. Mr. Otieno, the 28-year-old man, lived with his mother. But that day, he decided to walk onto his neighbor's lawn. He picked up several solar-powered lights and then began to bang on the door of his neighbor's house until his mother came and retrieved him and brought him back to his own home. The neighbor, whose door that Mr. Otieno was banging on, called the police to report a robbery incident, and Mr. Otieno was then taken into custody by police, where he was going to go to a hospital, but then, because apparently he was resisting arrest and became, quote, physically assaultive to the police officers, they decided to take him to a jail instead. There, Mr. Otieno was in the jail for 3 days until, on an emergency order, he was then transferred to the hospital where he was originally intended to have been taken to. And the incident occurred later that day that he arrived at the hospital. A horrifying, horrifying video. Mr. Otieno's mother said that he was deprived of proper medication at the jail and at the hospital where he was, and disputes that he was violent and assaultive both before going to the jail and at the hospital. Mr. Otieno's mother said, quote, "All of the systems failed my son. They set a trap for him." This week, the 10 individuals who were involved in this incident, the 7 sheriff's deputies and the 3 medical staff members, have all been formally indicted with second-degree murder. And again, as more information comes out about what caused this incident, what led to these 10 people to sit on this individual for 11 minutes straight, more of that information will come out in the coming days and weeks, and we will update you as it comes out. Now on to another news story pertaining to the city in which we are filming, Los Angeles. 400,000 LA Unified School District students have missed school this week, 3 days of school to be exact, amid teachers' union strikes who are demanding better working conditions and higher wages. Now, LAUSD is the second largest school district in the nation, encompassing over 450 schools across LA County. The Service Employees International Union, Local 99 Teachers Union, and the United Teachers Union of Los Angeles, both of which include educators and bus drivers, cafeteria workers, custodians, teaching aides, and other staff, have organized this 3-day strike. They have walked off the job protesting that the wages that they get now are far too little in order to keep up with the cost of living in Southern California. They cited that most of part-time employees in the LA Unified School District make $25,000 on average annually. Some of our bus drivers are actually homeless, says Lynette Boyd Peterson, a bus driver of the LAUSD school district. Some of our bus drivers are actually homeless. Some of them can't pay their bills, she says. They can't even pay their mortgage. It is impossible to live. Now, district officials have reported that they have offered these two unions a 23% pay raise over a 5-year period, including bonuses. However, these two teachers' unions have not responded to the district officials' offer and instead have affirmed that they are seeking an overall pay raise of 30% in base salary over 4 years and an additional $2 per hour increase for the lowest paid workers, especially those bus drivers, custodians, and cafeteria workers. This is the second time in 4 years that the LAUSD district has gone on strike, the most famous of which happened a few years ago, and it lasted for 6 days until the unions came to an agreement with district officials. And we have been seeing an uptick in strikes, not just pertaining to teachers' unions, but pertaining to other public sector unions around the country as increasingly the economy becomes worse and it becomes more difficult to keep up with the costs of living. There was a recent report, according to the Epoch Times, that Americans are defaulting on their car payments at the highest rate since the 2009 financial crisis. We see that the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates to 6.4%, that inflation is extremely high, what it's at an all-time high over the past 20 years, and our monetary policy is increasingly coming to harm us and making it difficult for all of us Americans, not just those who are getting a government salary, from living comfortably. Now, we saw recently that that was on display with the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. But what I would like to point out to you in this instance is how certain mistakes and certain policy misjudgments build on one another to culminate in what we are seeing now. We look at this LAUSD teachers union strike and we think that their low wages sort of exist in an entity onto its own. It's a separate and discrete event that doesn't have connections to other things. But actually, if you look at the policies that our government has pursued over the past couple of years, what we are seeing now, including the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, makes sense. Actually, one of the biggest things that has harmed us has been President Biden's positions towards drilling here in the United States. Under President Trump, we were actually oil independent, meaning that we did not seek oil from our foreign adversaries and from corrupt dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. President Trump reopened drilling and fracking facilities in places like Texas and off the coast of California. But when President Biden came into office and when the Democrats took control of Congress, they pushed forth all of these new pieces of legislation to try to combat drilling. Now, it is worth noting that just a few weeks ago, as I reported on this show, President Biden has agreed to an $8 billion drilling project in Alaska, but that is under immense economic pressure and re-election pressure, given that he is running in 2024 and the economy is so bad. But when you get rid of drilling and when you make the United States oil dependent, it really does harm our economy, not to mention our international relations by entreating to dictatorial regimes, but it harms our economy, kills jobs, and jacks up prices. Oil surrounds so much of the inflationary and economic problems that we are seeing today. Additionally, President Biden has pursued irresponsible monetary policy, ranging from generous subsidies to, among other things, solar companies and green new energy companies. And also the massive amounts of forgiveness plans and payouts that we gave during the COVID-19 pandemic is coming back to haunt us by rising the costs of goods around us and, of course, creating inflation and causing the Fed to increase interest rates. So if you see, it's all just kind of a cycle here where you would think, what does drilling have to do with a teachers union strike? But so many of these policies that we see, we think that they are contained, but again, they build on one another to create this situation. Many economists are suspecting that in the coming months, we are barreling towards a recession as banks continue to seem to struggle and as more unions and everyday Americans struggle with meeting their basic costs. So that is another story that we will certainly keep you updated on. We hope that the LAUSD district and the teachers unions that they are in conflict with can come to an agreement that is fair for both sides soon. This week marks 20 years since the United States invasion of Iraq. 2 episodes ago, I gave a brief history of the invasion, some of the U.S. foreign policy mistakes in the Middle East dating back to the 1950s that culminated in the catastrophic intervention, and events that have occurred in Iraq in recent years. In 2003, U.S. forces overthrew the brutal Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist government in just 3 weeks. But without Saddam's iron fist, Iraqi society crumbled. Kidnapping, torture, car bombings, and mass executions became commonplace. Al-Qaeda's Iraqi franchise tried to replace Saddam and led the Sunnis against the Shiites in a sectarian civil war from 2006 to 2008. And then, in a sinister twist, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, metastasized in 2004 in response to the U.S. invasion. In 2014, ISIS took over a third of Iraq, including the second largest city of Mosul. ISIS ethnically cleansed Christians and Yazidis, awarded women as chattel prizes to its fighters, and video recorded its cinematic medieval executions, which it showcased on social media. They destroyed Mosul's rich history, including monuments, transcripts, libraries, and books, and tried to replace it with their own version of history. A few weeks ago, I was watching a documentary about Iraq when I learned the story of an amazingly courageous Iraqi citizen, Omar Mohammed. He was born and raised in Mosul, living through all of the events that I just described. He graduated from the University of Mosul in 2012 and taught there until ISIS took it over. In 2014, he founded an online blog called Mosul Eye, where he documented what it was like to live under ISIS. Given that access to the internet was limited and that ISIS recruited spies and tried to prevent any information about the regime coming out to the world, Mosul Eye proved to be a critical source of information for journalists and scholars, and crucially, a source of hope for fellow Iraqis. And he actually ran Mosul Eye on a computer just one thin wall away from where a senior ISIS fighter lived. Mr. Mohammed was exiled from Iraq in 2017, and now that ISIS is gone from the region, he has dedicated his life to restoring the lost history of his home city of Mosul and to educating audiences around the world about the brutality that the Iraqi people endured. I am honored to welcome him to Timeless today. Mr. Mohammed, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Julie, for hosting me.
I told you before the program that I was so moved by watching you in the documentary, and I felt that I came to know you and the fellow Iraqis in that documentary. For those who are wondering, it is called Once Upon a Time in Iraq. It does an incredible job of explaining the recent history. So let's go back, if you don't mind, to the year that you were born. Would you mind telling audiences not to try to reveal your age? You look very young. What year were you born?
I was born in 1986. I do remember the date was Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Yeah,
Well, so that means that you were born just a few years before the first Gulf War, when President George H.W. Bush sent forces to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein invading. So you must have been very young during that time. Can you take me back to some of your earliest memories? What was it like living in Iraq during that period of history?
let me start with the first memory I have, which is spending time in the basement, where many of our relatives and many families had to hide in the basement in our house, as it used to be the largest house in the neighborhood during the 1990s war and the Desert Storm, hiding from the bombs, um, growing up there and spending over a month hearing all the chatters and the stories of women, mothers telling their children that they have to be patient, they have to wait until all this end, and kids just want to play. Their parents couldn't give them what they wanted. But I also developed at that time my sense of history and its importance, especially listening to stories from my grandmother. Um, but definitely the memories of fear, not knowing what would happen in the next hour, in the next day. How will this end? Looking at my parents, yes, I was very young, but I still see the frustration on my father's face, on my mother's face, their fear, the frustration, and also not knowing what being a child is, which is something that grew up with me. I still don't remember I have had a normal childhood, not knowing how to play with other kids, not knowing what it means to be a normal person. Definitely the definition of being normal or definition of the word itself, normal, has completely a different meaning from any other dictionary in the world.
So forgive me, just to clarify. So you were saying that some of your earliest memories are hiding in this basement during the first Gulf War. My understanding is that, well, President George H.W. Bush went into Kuwait to push Iraqi forces back to Iraq. There was also an invasion of Iraq. Is that right?
That's
And that's
correct.
what you're
That's
referring
accurate.
to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's accurate.
Because
But not to mention that all this happened also before that, before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, before the Kuwait War, there was an 8 years war between Iraq and Iran. That's where when I was born, in the middle of the Iraqi-Iranian war.
I see. Yes, that's right. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran into 1980 because he viewed it as weak after the 1979 revolution. I see what you were
Yes.
referring to. So what you just said about, your view of childhood is very fascinating and obviously incredibly sobering and sad. Did you think that the life that you were living was normal? Did you have a sense of how war-torn your region was and that some other places in the world lived in relative peace and prosperity? Or was this all you knew and you thought that most people lived this way?
I think I couldn't or I wouldn't know because I couldn't see any other life. I didn't know what, as I mentioned, what a normal life is. I didn't have access at my generation. We didn't have access to any part of the outside world. What we watch on the TV is the continuously broadcasted speeches of Saddam or the uh, uh, um, staged protest that the Ba'ath Party would broadcast every day. Not to mention what they call it. This is the program that myself, my generation, we still remember. It's called So We Will Never Forget, which is scenes from the Iraqi-Iranian war, scenes of destruction, scenes of dead bodies of both Iraqis and Iranians. It is very difficult to know during that time what a normal life is, because you don't have any different side to compare with. We couldn't understand this, and especially growing up, it became also difficult to understand. So it was too late when we understood that there was a completely different life than the one we lived.
Mm. What
We were
was
completely isolated.
mm. What was your view of Saddam Hussein growing up? Obviously, it was unlawful to speak out against the regime. It would have terrible consequences if you did. But was there sort of an underground or clandestine, silent, if you will, understanding of Saddam's brutality, and was there resistance against him?
I think what defined the people's rejection of Saddam can only be measured through the amount of jokes Iraqis developed during that time, and it was their way of expression against Saddam. So, and this would only happen inside houses, inside the households. People would make jokes about Saddam, or they would use or make reference to certain animals, and the reference is about Saddam. I think this is, and I have started personally. I have started reviewing and looking into all the history of jokes in Iraq, and I found that there is a fascinating history of jokes and how it developed. But other than that, uh, speaking out against Saddam means completely the erasure of not only the person but the entire family. And not only this, there was a law under Saddam that if a person is caught as a member of the opposition, the person would be killed and his family would pay the price of the bullet.
Mm.
That's how brutal Saddam was. And even with that type of internal discussions among families, making jokes and showing their frustration against Saddam, we grew up also with always being reminded that you have to be careful of what you say, which is why we still have the expression, the walls have ears. Even inside, there was a time when inside your house, inside your bedroom, you cannot speak against the regime because someone might be listening. The psychology Saddam used, or the psychological operations that regime used, is they created a sense of distrust among everyone. A brother couldn't trust his brother, or a mother couldn't trust her children. He created this kind of, he dismantled the social codes, the ethical codes, and the social structure of the small families, starting from the family to the entire population.
Mm. That makes sense. You know, one of the things that I learned from the documentary that you were featured in is that the fear of Saddam was so great that it was even more overpowering than sectarian differences between Sunnis and Shiites. Though Saddam was a Sunni leader of a Shiite majority country, as you say, people were so, you know, captured by the fear of resisting him that in a way it sort of disintegrated or quelled those otherwise prominent divisions.
He definitely practiced dictatorship, but also practiced or implanted the sectarianism. He created this sense of that Shia are not loyal to Iraq, and the only loyal people are the Sunnis. And this can be easily understood from the way he structured his government, his security forces, and he wouldn't give a high-ranking position in the military, for example, to a Shia Iraqi. He would rather give it to a relative, or he would choose a Sunni person. Sunnis also were put in this position that they are they have been seen as representatives of the regime, or that they are complicit with the regime, and that's the game he played. Uh, and it is something he also developed over the time through the Iraqi-Iranian war. As long as you are Shia, you are being suspected of being loyal to Iran rather than to Iraq, and that's how he would always create the differences among the people, trying to create distrust among the population, and he would show that the only way to show your loyalty to Iraq is by following the orders of Saddam. Other than that, you are seen as a traitor.
Did you ever see Saddam?
No, not directly, but I was present when he came to Mosul during what they call it the spring festivals. Not from a very close angle, I would say.
Before we move on to talking about the 2003 invasion, I'd like to first ask you, what was your view of the United States prior to 2003? Because if you look at this time that you were born in and growing up in, the United States had a pretty heavy hand in the Middle East. In 1953, we overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh, to reinstall the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was pro-American and pro-Western. So there was that in Iran, and then we sort of turned our back on the Shah in 1979 to allow the revolution to happen. Certainly the first Gulf War, when we invaded Iraq and when we invaded Kuwait to help push Saddam back, there was a lot of United States presence in the region, specifically surrounding Iraq. What was your view of all of that? Specifically, starting off, why don't we start off with what happened in Iran and then turn to what happened in Iraq? How did you view the United States?
Let me start with this. This might seem like a joke, but that's the reality that I remember. Before understanding what was happening, in fact, all I know about the United States from that time was the smuggled movies of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Rambo and Van Damme. But add to that, I understood that my father had some recordings of Johnny Cash. That was my knowledge about the United States up until I started understanding what was going on, until I started understanding that the United States is heavily involved in politics in Saudi Arabia, what their action with Mossadegh in Iran, and their presence in the Gulf, their presence in the Egyptian politics, and definitely the relation between Iraq and the United States. It was frustrating to understand how all this relationship was built on one powerful side, which is the United States, and the other side, which is Middle Eastern countries, that they have to follow the orders. Not to mention that later on, from late 90s, the Iraqi TV started broadcasting details about, or more in depth, broadcasting about the United States, where we started knowing how the United States is the enemy of Iraq, how Saddam is trying to stop the United States from taking over the Arab lands, and how it's also was put, and this is probably the strongest attitude that was present in Saddam's policy, and especially in his media and propaganda policy, is that the United States is Israel and Israel is the United States, and that his vision and his mission is to free Palestine. Therefore, he has to start first with the United States. It was all forming around this topic. It's all being formed around how Israel and the United States are collaborating to take over the Middle East, and this is how the propaganda was growing. There was heavy, as I said, not only on media, but this is what we would also learn in schools, how media would portray the United States as the enemy of Iraq. How also, not only this, but how the education system would portray that some of the Gulf countries are actually collaborating with the United States, therefore they are the enemies of Iraq. Not to mention as well how Saddam would portray the Kurds as betraying and traitors of Iraq. All of this was coming almost extensively every day, and this is what we watch, this is what we listen to, this is what we learn in schools. Add to that we will be always forced every week to go out for a parade holding weapons and chanting long live Saddam.
Mm. Was there any sense from you of what life was like in America, the amount of freedom and prosperity that we were privileged enough to enjoy that stands in such stark contrast to the regime under which you were living? Did you or any of your peers and fellow citizens have any knowledge of that disparity?
I have to be honest, other than the movies we watched, we knew nothing.
That's very,
Yeah.
very interesting. Okay, so let's move forward a bit to the 2003 invasion. Or rather, why don't we go back 2 years prior to that to 9/11? When did you learn about 9/11 and how did you learn about it?
Yeah, I was coming. I do remember. I think it was Thursday, if I am not mistaken. Uh, I was coming back from school and we were watching this on the TV. I still remember my mother was cooking and she had a small TV in her kitchen. And we didn't understand what this was in the beginning until the anchor was explaining what was happening, that the World Trade Towers have been hit by airplane. Um, I think that's exactly the memory I have, and I still remember it very well. Um, I do believe there was a kind of an attitude or a behavior from some people who were celebrating this. Um, but I wouldn't say that this was on a large scale of population, that you wouldn't see this, for example, being celebrated widely among the people.
Mm. Did Saddam speak about 9/11 or the Ba'athist party at all?
I cannot remember any of this, to be honest. I don't remember hearing this, but it was circulating on the news for a very long time. It wasn't only a one day piece of news. It was circulating almost every day.
Mm. When Osama bin Laden came out shortly after 9/11 and claimed Al Qaeda's responsibility for the attack, what was your perception of that or your fellow Iraqi citizens' understanding of it? Was there, I know you said that there were some celebrations, but was there prior knowledge to you of Al Qaeda's presence in the region? To what extent did you know about Osama and Al Qaeda?
Yeah, to be precise, we had a prior knowledge of the existence of what they call them the Arab fighters in Afghanistan, and this was very very well known among Iraqis. We had some stories of people from Iraq joining the jihadists in Afghanistan during the Afghan Soviet war. We would hear the name of Abdullah Azzam, for example, who was the teacher of Osama bin Laden. We would receive news like this. This would be something that is common, I would say common knowledge among the people, that you would know about what was happening in Afghanistan. But I'm not sure that people would know who Osama bin Laden was up until the brutal attack against the United States. From that time, it became widely known. People would speak about it. I do remember that in some of the mosques uh, uh, it was kind of celebrated, but it is something to connect the dots, to be honest. It is something that was matching also Saddam's policy during that time, because at that time, Saddam was becoming more or tolerating more the Islamism in Iraq. And this is how also when the Salafists or the radicals would find a space to speak out easily. And this is how you would see mosques would actually preach about this brutal attack against the United States.
When did it come into your consciousness that the United States was considering invading Iraq? Because in 2002, we invaded, or I believe actually maybe even in late 2001, we invaded Afghanistan first. And then the
Yes.
invasion of Iraq took another 2 years, as the United States believed, or members of the government believed, that Saddam had helped Osama bin Laden and that he possessed weapons of mass destruction to use against the West. When did you start to understand, oh my gosh, the United States is going to invade our country next?
I I think that nobody believed or ever thought that this would ever happen or even possible. No one, because no one believed that Saddam would ever be removed from power. But I would say that in 2002, when we were able to receive a TV channel that was broadcasting from Kurdistan, and this, of course, we would watch it secretly because it opens only after 9 p.m., where we hear and see for the first time, for example, the Iraqi opposition saying that they are in Kurdistan and that the liberation of Iraq would come very soon. Starting from mid 2002, this propaganda started growing, but also very beginning of 2003, it became very clear that the United States is going to invade Iraq. Three months before the invasion, it became very clear that this is the end. And I still remember my father when we were watching one of the speeches of Saddam, who was in his white suit. My father said something I still remember until now. He said, "This is a person who is leaving. This is not a person who is staying in power. This is probably the end."
Saddam could sense, you're saying, and even those who were watching Saddam could sense that he knew his time was up.
Yes. Yeah, it was very clear from the discourse he used, from the chatter among the people. It was very clear. Yeah, 3 months, I would say 3 to 4 months, it became very clear. I mean, everyone knew that there is an end to all of this.
Were you aware of the United States understanding or narrative, if you will, that Saddam was aiding al-Qaeda and possessed nuclear weapons of mass destruction? It is important to note that Saddam Hussein did possess chemical weapons of mass destruction that he used against his own people, but really our cause of going into Iraq was over those supposed possessions of nuclear weapons. Were you aware that that was the American impetus for invasion, and did Saddam acknowledge that at all?
We were hearing more about the mass destruction weapons and also the mission to investigate the Iraqi facilities. We would even see those cars and those delegations from time to time passing by through Mosul or in Baghdad. That was the discourse. It was more about the mass destruction weapons, which actually didn't exist in Iraq, and it was proven to be a complete lie, for which Iraq was invaded. It was the most dominating narrative around that time. We wouldn't hear that there was a connection between Saddam and Al Qaeda, or at least it wasn't public.
So let's go to the date that we are discussing and that happened 20 years ago this week, March 20th, 2003, when U.S. forces commenced their aerial bombardments on Baghdad. Where were you? What was the general sense of the invasion? Our vice president at the time, Dick Cheney, predicted that Americans would, quote, be greeted as liberators. Was that true?
It is very complicated to describe that moment. On one hand, I do believe, and I have to be honest. I am a historian, and I will mention the two sides of the story. Definitely, people were happy, but at the same time, this happiness was based on something they didn't know what the end of it. So they sensed that this is the end of Saddam, and this definitely brought joy to their hearts. But things completely and radically changed the moment Saddam was removed from power. We started, and not only it's not only about the invasion itself, but it's also how the generational trauma was working in Iraq when this dictator was removed from power and people are no more under any control of any government or any administration. The chaos that took place, the chaos that destroyed almost the entire social system of the country, is the price the people paid for a very short period of happiness. I think that's exactly what happened. People expected that there is going to be change, that all the people who were opposing Saddam, not those who came from outside Iraq, who were outside Iraq, but rather because there was a large number of people opposing Saddam from inside Iraq, but none of these people were considered. And this is how the very short moment of happiness actually ended shortly after a few months. But before that, you would see people looting the banks. You would see people looting the central library of the university. You would see people looting the governmental buildings. Everyone is trying to make a statement saying that this is my share from the last 30 years of Saddam's dictatorship. People went into chaotic life. I still remember seeing a very old woman carrying a monitor of a computer, not a TV. She thought it was a TV, and I asked her, like, why are you taking this? This is not even a TV. She said, this is my share from the last 30 years. This is the share of my children who were killed during the Iraqi-Iranian war. So people started thinking about, what should we do now? And absolutely no one had any answer to this. No one knew what's coming next.
It really is amazing how quickly it turned. To your point, how originally Iraqis were happy to have Saddam rid of, but then there was just no plan in place to ensure that Iraqi society could run properly. It's such a complicated and difficult question, and I almost hesitate to ask it because the business of counterfactuals is tricky. Do you think, though, that there could have been a scenario where the Americans did invade and oust Saddam and created a situation that could have ultimately led to what was proclaimed to have been our ultimate goal, and that is have Iraqi citizens themselves run the country? Do you think in another world the U.S. invasion could have worked out?
Well, it's not only a theory or an assumption. It actually was possible from the beginning. So let me give you an example. I interviewed David Petraeus, the former CIA director, and also he was the commander of 101 Airborne. The U.S. Army in Mosul, when they arrived on April 10th, 2003, and it was a Friday. They literally entered Mosul at 10:30 a.m. From that day, the city of Mosul started thinking of how should we run the city now that Saddam have been removed. How should we deal with the Ba'athis who have been ruling us with brutality? How should we move? So there was a meeting of what we call them the wise people of the city, and they were invited to discuss the future of Mosul. And in all honesty, Mosul witnessed in its history, in its first time in the last, probably, I do believe in the last century, in a century, witnessed a democratic election of its Council of Representatives, where you also have over 40% of them are women. There was a plan in place where the people said, look, you have to listen to us, speaking to the commanders. This is how we should run the city. This is what we should do. But what went wrong, and the problem is, starting 2004, it was the insurgency, or the rise of the insurgency. All those people who became part of the civil administration, they were seen as collaborators with the United States Army. So they were targeted, and everyone started thinking like, I should go home. Why should I risk my life staying here? And this is how also the United States, and they could have done it differently, but they rather decided not to go toward developing the civil society and the civil administration. And I am not speaking just as a witness to this, but I have exclusively interviewed the people who were in charge of the civil administration in 2003, including one of them I will not name, but he is now in a very high-ranking position of the European Union. He told me, I was sitting face to face with him. He told me that we were pushing the US government that we should invest more in the civil administration. And the response was, we are sorry, this is costly, what we want is fighters. They, instead of investing in civil administration, they went on investing in arming the tribes, thinking that this is the most effective way to counter insurgency. And this is what happened. But before that, the largest mistake, or the biggest mistake, is they decided that we should dismantle all the army. You literally dismantled over 1 million armed, well-trained personnel and told them, go home. What would the commanders expect? And they knew, most of the commanders knew that this is going to be the scenario. If you send them home, they will come back to fight. That's what happened, because they realized that they do not have a plan to run the country. They do not have a plan to develop the promised democracy in the country. They didn't have a plan to invest in the civil administration, which would lead the country. Definitely 5 to 7 years of chaos is expected, and that is normal when you move from dictatorship to democracy. But after that, when you have a plan in place, you put a plan in motion, the result would be very clear. A country would move to a more peaceful path. But that didn't happen. So answering your question, yes, they had the power to take this direction and build the civil administration. But as this official told me, he said it was costly. Which is why we saw George W. Bush landing in Anbar, granting or giving the weapons and the money and the 4X4 vehicles to the tribes, telling them, go and fight Al-Qaeda.
What was it like when Al-Qaeda came into Iraq? In 2006, that was the year that Saddam was executed, and then that same year the sectarian conflict descended, starting with Al-Qaeda, which is obviously a pan-Islamist terrorist organization, but primarily Sunni, bombing a Shiite mosque in Iraq. How I know it sounds like a sort of simple question, but can you describe to me sort of how life changed when that happened? Because already there was the US invasion, already there was so much chaos. And then what about the sectarian conflict or about Al-Qaeda coming in changed?
Well, before the sectarianism itself, Al-Qaeda targeted everyone who wouldn't agree or join their organization. They even targeted other terrorist groups, trying to force them to be part of Al-Qaeda itself. But the very important part of the Al-Qaeda strategy was using sectarianism in order to rule over the Sunnis. They were attacking the Shia to try to tell the Sunnis. Of course, the Shia militias would also attack the Sunnis, and this is what Al-Qaeda was trying to do, is showing the Sunnis that you have no other option but to be with Al-Qaeda. And this was very well expressed in Zarqawi's strategy, and especially in his 2005 proclamation of the Islamic State. And many analysts and historians think that the establishment of Islamic State was only 2004. But in fact, Al-Qaeda was transforming in 2005 when they declared the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, but it wasn't taken into action. It was still Al-Qaeda acting until they would gain more power. In his strategy, he was making it very clear, even in his communication with Zawahiri at that time. He would say that we must kill more Shia, so they would kill more Sunnis to show the Sunnis that there is no other way for you, there is no way of protection but to follow Al-Qaeda. This was explicitly written in their strategy. And there is another document known as Fallujah Memorandum, which doesn't have the names of the authors, but it's believed to be written by some of the senior leaders of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In this memorandum that was produced in 2009, they were still putting plans on how to bring the Sunni population closer as more a friendly environment to the jihadists. The way they would use is kill more Shia, bomb more Shia, go to Najaf and Karbala and kill all of them, and make it very clear that the suicide bomber is Sunni. That's what was happening. And the United States Army, of course, with the Iraqi security forces that were established on sectarian basis, they weren't actually doing anything rather than protecting their bases. The people were left alone. You are either under the brutality of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, or you have no other way but to leave the country.
So it's not so much that Al-Qaeda cared about the Sunni population, they were using the Shias to as sort of pawns against the Sunnis in order to show the Sunnis that they were their saviors or their
definitely it's not an analysis of Al-Qaeda. It's actually a written policy by Al-Qaeda itself. It even created a dispute between Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's why also where we saw the correspondence between Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They would tell him like, stop bombing cars, not stop, but make it lower numbers of car bombs. He would say, no, we need to kill more people. We need to kill more Shia. That's the only way to keep the Sunnis under our control. It is a written strategy. It is much more beyond the criminal unorganized crime. It is the doctrine of evil, I would call it. That's what they were doing, because the same time they were killing the Shia, they were also killing the Sunnis. They didn't care about what your identity is. All they cared about is spreading fear. Zawahiri, Zarqawi, in also his strategy, he would say, rule them by the fear. Make your governance completely based on the fear. That's how you keep control over them.
Before we move on to ISIS's takeover in 2014, and of course, the founding of your online blog, Mosul Eye, during this time, the United States in 2008 helped come in and rid the country of al-Qaeda. Were you so angry at this time at the United States? Did you just feel like these people came in, they screwed everything up? Yes, they got rid of Saddam, but look at what came in their wake. And now they're just sort of coming in and out temporarily to help squash one problem before another arose. Was there this sense of anti-Americanism and resentment at the United States for causing this? Or were all of you just so sort of enraptured with the sectarian conflict and with the evil of al-Qaeda that the focus wasn't so much on the Americans as instigators?
Yeah, I would say starting 2009, not 2008. 2008 it was 2007, 8. It was the beginning of the counter-offensive, especially the offensive in Tel Afar, the offensive in Anbar, and later on the offensive in Mosul. It cleared out all the cities from al-Qaeda. I do believe the relation or the perception of the US or the United States military presence in Iraq kind of changed. The people started feeling safer, and they didn't have the same perception of their presence like they did back in 2003 onward to 2007. Because let me tell you something, in 2005, when the first election was held in Iraq, al-Qaeda would cut the fingers of everyone who would go to vote. And the reason why they cut the finger is for every voter to prove that you are voting, and to prevent you from voting twice, is to put your finger in the ink. And that's what the al-Qaeda would do, is to cut that finger. That's what was the daily life, is brutality all over the streets. Therefore, in 2009, things changed. We saw in the United States military presence more of an insurance to provide us with safety, not only because they got rid of al-Qaeda. We have to be precise here. It is because we couldn't trust the government and its forces. So we would run toward the US military and feel safe rather than running toward an Iraq security checkpoint.
Can you describe the day that ISIS forces came into Mosul, and how was ISIS different than al-Qaeda? Obviously, ISIS is known for its cinematic, as I described in the introduction, medieval executions that it put on social media. But you describe sort of ISIS stepping the terror up a bit from al-Qaeda. So how were the forces different in their tactics? How were they ideologically different? And what was it like, my God, to have ISIS take over your city?
It's well, their level of brutality is not that different, but their strategies differ. Al-Qaeda doesn't have the same strategy of establishing a state, because they think that comes at the end, while Daesh thinks, the only difference is that Daesh thinks that they should start by establishing the caliphate and everything else comes later. But the brutality of both is actually the same. And they would have competitions who would kill more. What happened and how ISIS started growing in Mosul and in Nineveh province in general, in Anbar as well, is when the people lost the trust in the security forces, when the security forces were still practicing sectarianism against a majority Sunni population in those provinces, ISIS infiltrated this and amplified this sectarianism policy. And they started establishing their space and their presence by infiltrating inside the security forces, to the extent back in 2012, if there is a construction tender by the government and they want to build, let's say, a school, no one could do this without having to pass through ISIS first, because ISIS would need a share. And this is the period 2011, the withdrawal of the United States Army from Iraq, onward, the beginning of ISIS's financial empire. They were completely focused on finance. And of course, they used the brutality to expand their finance. They would kidnap people for ransom, but they would also collect taxes from people. They would go door to door. They would have the database of every business person in Mosul and ask them to pay the taxes. And this started growing until 2014, when on June 2014, the 6th of June 2014, the attack happened at 3 a.m. And this is the moment when everything in our entire life, in our entire history, has completely changed.
What was it like interacting with ISIS officials in your city? As I said in the introduction, I was stunned to learn that you conducted Mosul Eye, your online blog, just a thin wall away from a senior ISIS leader, so you must have been interacting with them constantly. What was the nature of that interaction? Did you have to sort of pretend like you were with them?
I didn't pretend to be with them because that was very risky and dangerous. But rather, as a historian, as someone who also studied the Islamic history, the Islamic theology, so I have knowledge. Plus, many of them were actually people we knew from the university, from the neighborhood, including a professor at the university. She was a professor teaching at the university. All of a sudden, she became ISIS, or she rather was already an ISIS member, but then she showed up later. What happened, or the way I actually acted, is trying to get as much as possible information firsthand, to witness what the events myself. But when it's difficult, I would actually speak to the people, to the public. I would later act as a taxi driver, because I do know people, especially in Iraq, people speak a lot with the taxi driver. Or I would work in a bakery of a friend of mine, because I know that this was on a street where Daesh military would keep moving. They would even buy the bread. But definitely interacting with them. That was also the most important part of it, is trying to speak to them, trying to get an understanding directly from them. And this was also very difficult, and didn't actually continue, didn't last long, because at a moment I was so afraid that I would be asked the very difficult question, like, would you join us? And the answer, the two answers, there is no wrong answer, as they say. If I join, I will definitely be joining my enemy, and if I say no, I will be definitely killed. So I didn't want to reach this point, which is why I continued my clandestine work, observing everything, documenting everything, going to even the hospital to document the number of the people who were either executed or ISIS, Daesh members who were killed in air strikes, etc. I have a full record of how many people were killed, their names, the description of the time of death, and the description of the corpse. I have extensive details that sometimes I am so scared to go back and read it.
Mm. How, when you would talk with people about Mosul Eye, or perhaps maybe you didn't speak with people about Mosul Eye, how would you know that
Definitely not.
Yeah, well, that would make sense. Well, it was fascinating during the documentary to see the other Iraqis who were interviewed talk about Mosul Eye, and how much hope it gave them, knowing that there was someone among them who was documenting these atrocities, not just letting them, disappear into the abyss of history in order to educate people around the country and around the world about ISIS terror. What was how did you gather the courage to do something so heroic? I mean, in a time like that, I can imagine that one just wants to survive and not ruffle any feathers, let alone do something as brave and incredibly dangerous as creating an online resistance movement to the regime. What was it in you that made you feel like you had to do this?
Having witnessed all this violence pre-2014, which actually defined who we are. It defined our way of life. But it also created a more pressing need to resist this, to not normalize the violence, to not normalize this narrative of history of Mosul. But most importantly, I am a person who cares a lot about future. I am a historian, but history for me is about the future. It's not about the past. And I was so scared of the scenario because I knew Daesh will end. I knew that this will not last long. It might take. I had a theory that it might take maximum 5 years, but thankfully it didn't take that long. But I knew it will not last long. But I was so scared about post-Daesh. And the questions I had, or the concerns I had, is that what will happen when all this ends and the people will ask why no one from Mosul took an action against Daesh? That means the entire city will be judged this way. That means the city will not have any answers. And this, we are speaking about over 3 million people. Not to mention also that Daesh identified itself as a Sunni organization, and that implies that all Sunnis are complicit in all of this. I was concerned about the movement, even not this day, not in the next 10 years, but rather years yet to come. What people will ask, they will ask very difficult questions. And imagine when this day comes, and imagine Mosul doesn't have a story to tell. It will be not our story anymore. It will be the story of whoever wants to write it. That's why, is to make sure that we write our own story, but we also write it based on what we did, even if it meant that I would be killed. And I did accept this reality. I accepted that I would or might at one day be caught by Daesh, and I would always be ready, because I would always, not directly telling my mother goodbye, but I will always show her a sign that this is a goodbye.
So no one knew that you were the one behind Mosul Eye? No one in your family, none of your friends, no one?
Not even my mother. And you can't imagine how horrifying and difficult this was. Not being able to tell someone that you are scared, that you are tired, that you just want to give up, that you just want to stop all of this, that you just want to cry. I mean, it was more scaring to me than actually Daesh itself. I didn't fear Daesh, but the fact that I was sitting next to my mother, not being able to tell her what I feel, or to my friends, or to my family, not being able to express my feelings, having to hide my feelings, was really devastating.
That is very powerful. Why were you exiled in 2017?
At the moment of 2000, end of 2016, the pressure was growing because there were more airstrikes against Daesh, which forced Daesh to shrink.
Which is ISIS, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's ISIS
Yes.
you're referring to. Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Go on.
yes, Daesh. We call it Daesh. they started moving their warehouses. They started moving their checkpoints very close to the residential areas. They did have before the military camps, not outside the city, but at least a bit far from where people live. But it ended up that not only the next door is a senior Daesh leader, but their checkpoints on the front door of our house. The house next door from the other side was full of weapons. The one next to us was where their snipers and anti-aircraft unit was there. So I was completely surrounded, and I thought of what would happen to my family if I was caught, thinking of reporting literally against them from inside this surrounded house. What would happen to my family? I could never live with the fact that my family would be punished for something I chose to do, which is why I actually decided to leave. But the problem is, when I thought I would come back after the defeat of Daesh, I realized that the Iraqi government also has problems with me, because as long as I would report against Daesh, they are happy. But when I also reported the atrocities committed by the security forces during the liberation of Mosul, where many people were killed, others were actually disappeared, and also the destruction of the city that could have been done in a different way, the liberation. When I disagreed with all of this, they saw me as persona non grata.
That makes sense. So you left Iraq, but then when the Iraqi government found out that you were the one behind Mosul Eye, they didn't want a whistleblower to turn against them. So
Exactly.
During the time that you were conducting Mosul Eye, ISIS was aware that Mosul Eye existed.
Well, they knew. I mean, I saw the file of Mosul Eye after the liberation, because I obtained several documents. They had a very big file about Mosul Eye and analysis about who might be Mosul Eye. Of course, their first assumption was this is a psych op by the CIA. Others would say he is a Shia, he is a Christian. They never believed that a Sunni would do this, or someone called Omar. I mean, they didn't expect this. They would threaten people that if they access Mosul Eye, they would find them and arrest them and kill them. But nevertheless, the people were able to access Mosul Eye. I hear the stories after the liberation. Of course, people at the beginning, they couldn't speak about this, but later on, I would hear stories from people telling me that we would send a text message or call our relatives who are living outside Mosul, asking them to check Mosul Eye to tell us what is happening in Mosul. And the people are in Mosul. So they would want, because they are afraid of accessing it from Mosul, but they ask people from outside to check, can you check what's happening, what's being published on Mosul Eye, because we want to know what's going on in Mosul. To that extent, Mosul Eye was a very important resource for not only the world, but also to the, most importantly for me as well, is to the people of Mosul.
Now that you are a few years away from this, and my God, I was actually about to say a decade, and then I realized this happened so recently, just about 6 years ago. It's a personal question, but how are you doing now? How are you able to cope with the tragedy that you have witnessed and endured? What kind of role does this history of yours play in your everyday life?
I think in every aspect of my life, even of my daily life, I still refuse to work in anything that is not related to Mosul. I worked as a professor at Sciences Po University, but then I decided that I would go back to my work on Mosul. It shaped my entire life. It defined my future, and I don't know if I will ever leave Mosul or Mosul will ever leave me. I think that's my destiny. Until the moment when I feel that Mosul is rebuilt, that the people are able to move on, to continue their life, to see a different future, away from Daesh, away from all extremism and radicalism, that the people also are able to reconcile with history, but also to confront the past with courage. Until that moment, I will always be dedicated and committed to Mosul.
Well, thanks to you, I now know about Mosul, which I did not before, and I know so much about the history of Iraq. You are truly a hero, and thank you very much for coming on to the show today.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you for bringing this discussion. It is very important for me always to speak about Mosul, to also give a context to the audience to understand the history of Mosul. A very complicated history, but despite all these tragedies we lived, in fact, Mosul is now recovering slowly but surely. We are happy that there are many foreign tourists, no more terrorists, but tourists coming to Mosul, and the city is recovering, and hopefully Mosul will claim its rightful place in history again, because the name of Mosul literally means the connector, is to connect between two sides, between two things, and that's how the city over the history played this role of connecting different cultures, different ideas. Yeah, and I think I only hope that life will be better. But I would close with, probably this is my golden rule of Bertrand Russell, my favorite philosopher, when he say one should care about a world one will not see, and that's what I am doing. I care about the future that I might not see.
Where can we follow you and learn more about your work?
Just check Mosul Eye on Google, and you will find everything.
It's
You can
still
find
up
me
and
on,
running.
yeah, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Just type Mosul Eye, and you will easily find it.
Well, you have a devoted follower in me. God bless you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for joining us today, and remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Take care.